The power of underestimation is one of the most recurring themes in history. Nations, like individuals, often misjudge potential when it doesn't roar loudly enough. In America's case, its greatest strategic blunder wasn't hostility toward India, but an enduring disbelief in India's capacity to transform itself. For decades, Washington viewed New Delhi through a lens of charity rather than partnership, of instability rather than ingenuity. The assumption was that India, with its sprawling democracy and messy politics, could never match the discipline or decisiveness of major powers. But beneath the visible chaos, something extraordinary was unfolding, a long game of resilience, reform, and reinvention that America simply failed to read. In the early years after independence, India's ambitions were often dismissed as idealistic, even naive, to the American mind. Steeped in capitalist realism, India's slow, cautious approach to growth seemed outdated. But what appeared slow was in fact deliberate. A democracy testing its foundations, an economy balancing tradition and modernity, a society learning to hold 1 billion voices under one flag. America, impatient for results and addicted to speed, mistook this patience for paralysis. It saw India's internal debates as dysfunction, not realizing they were the heartbeat of democracy itself. By the time America began to take notice, India had already rewritten its own script. It built an education system that became the world's supplier of engineers, doctors, and innovators. Its IT revolution quietly reshaped the global economy, with Indian minds designing the systems that powered Silicon Valley itself. Yet even as Indian talent became indispensable abroad, Washington continued to underestimate the force behind it. The narrative remained that India excelled in exporting brains, not building power. It was a narrow view that blinded America to the deeper transformation, a nation moving from a service provider to a strategic powerhouse. Underestimation has a strange side effect. It grants the underestimated time. While America was focused on containing China and maintaining hegemony in Europe and the Middle East, India was left free to evolve without excessive interference. It built its defense industry, developed indigenous space and nuclear capabilities, and established global credibility in science and technology. Each quiet success became a brick in the fortress of self-reliance that few in Washington even noticed until the wall stood firm. When America finally realized the scale of India's rise, it wasn't through military posturing or political speeches. It was through influence. India began to shape global narratives, from digital governance to sustainable growth, from supply chain resilience to the moral dimensions of foreign policy. The world started listening when India spoke, and that shift of attention carried an unmistakable message. The underestimated had become the indispensable. America's miscalculation wasn't just about missing a partner's potential. It was about misreading the evolution of global power itself, the transition from dominance to dialogue, from control to cooperation. Underestimating India was easy because its power didn't look familiar. It wasn't built on aggressive expansion or ideological export. It was rooted in civilizational confidence and quiet competence. America, accustomed to grandstanding and spectacle, failed to recognize a form of strength that didn't need to shout. The price of that underestimation wasn't a single diplomatic defeat or lost deal. It was the slow erosion of strategic foresight, the kind that leaves even a superpower playing catch-up in a world it once thought it led. Technology has always been the most silent yet decisive battlefield of modern power. While armies march and diplomats debate, the real victories are often coded in algorithms, satellites, and silicon chips. America, for decades, believed it held unchallenged supremacy in this domain. Silicon Valley was its fortress, innovation its flag, and disruption its creed. But while the United States was celebrating its dominance, India was quietly laying the groundwork for something unprecedented, a technological renaissance born not of luxury, but of necessity. In the background of America's loud innovation culture, India's silent revolution was redefining what it meant to be a digital superpower. The contrast was striking. In the West, technology evolved from abundance. In India, it emerged from scarcity. While American firms chased convenience, Indian innovators chased inclusion. Out of this urgency came tools not designed for the elite, but for everyone, a philosophy that would ultimately reshape the digital landscape. The most glaring example of this shift was India's Unified Payments Interface, UPI, a homegrown innovation that turned smartphones into wallets and revolutionized financial access. What America treated as a fintech experiment, India transformed into a public utility, scalable, secure, and seamless. By the time the world noticed, UPI was processing more digital transactions per month than all major Western systems combined. It wasn't a flashy breakthrough, it was quiet efficiency, and that's what made it powerful. The same story unfolded across sectors. In space technology, America long saw India's missions as symbolic, low-cost gestures of ambition rather than genuine competition. But when the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, began launching missions to Mars and the Moon at a fraction of NASA's budget, the narrative shifted. India wasn't competing for prestige. It was proving that intelligence and ingenuity could outvalue expenditure. The Chandrayaan and Mangalyaan missions weren't just scientific triumphs. They were declarations that innovation doesn't have to be expensive to be extraordinary. America's misjudgment lay in assuming that efficiency meant inferiority, that affordability implied compromise. In truth, India was mastering a new model of technological sovereignty, one that made excellence accessible. Meanwhile, as America became entangled in debates over data monopolies and digital surveillance, India was quietly crafting a framework that blended innovation with ethics. The Digital India Initiative, Aadhaar, and public data platforms collectively built one of the largest digital ecosystems in the world, not owned by corporations, but by the people. It was a model of technology as empowerment, not exploitation. The same nation that once struggled with paperwork and bureaucracy had, within a decade, digitized identity, governance, and finance at an unimaginable scale. While the United States exported social media, India exported digital infrastructure, and that distinction became its silent victory. In the global tech race, America's oversight wasn't technological, it was philosophical. It believed leadership came from invention, while India believed it came from implementation. America focused on creating billion-dollar startups, India focused on creating billion-user systems. One sought profit, the other sought participation. This subtle difference redefined the entire meaning of digital power. The world began to notice that the next big innovation might not emerge from Silicon Valley's glass towers, but from India's crowded streets, places where technology was solving real human problems rather than manufacturing new ones. The battlefield of technology is not always visible, but its outcomes are unmistakable. Every app, every satellite, every digital network tells a story of power, not in who created it first, but who used it best. America, for too long, viewed India as a consumer of technology rather than a creator. Yet, in the silence of its laboratories, startups, and data centers, India was rewriting that story. The cost of America's misjudgment is now clear. It underestimated not just a nation's capability, but its conviction, the determination to turn necessity into innovation and innovation into influence. Economic irony often wears a quiet smile, the kind that appears when predictions age poorly. For decades, America viewed India as a vast consumer market, not a competitive economy. It wanted India as a buyer, not a builder, a participant, not a producer. The irony, of course, is that while Washington strategized to make India dependent on its capital and corporations, India used that very access to build independence. What began as a trade imbalance evolved into a strategic reversal, a story of how the underestimated economy turned the tables on its patronizing partner. America's oversight wasn't a single miscalculation. It was a pattern of arrogance that blinded it to India's evolving economic intelligence. The post-liberalization era of the 1990s should have been America's wake-up call. When India opened its markets, it wasn't an act of surrender, it was an act of strategy. While the US saw an opportunity to flood Indian consumers with Western goods, India saw an opening to absorb technology, management practices, and financial systems. Every foreign investment became a classroom. Every multinational that entered India left behind a fragment of knowledge, a blueprint of efficiency that Indian companies would later replicate, adapt, and outperform. America believed it was shaping India's economy. In truth, India was studying America's playbook and preparing to write its own version. By the 2010s, the balance had shifted in ways Washington hadn't anticipated. Indian firms weren't just competing domestically, they were buying American assets, investing in Silicon Valley, and entering global stock exchanges. The outsourcing that once symbolized America's dominance turned into a symbol of dependency. The very companies that had once relied on cheap Indian labor found themselves reliant on Indian software, Indian leadership, and Indian innovation. From Sundar Pichai at Google to Satya Nadella at Microsoft, the irony deepened. American corporations were now being led by the very minds that the US system had once underestimated. The intellectual exchange America thought it controlled had turned into a power transfer it never planned for. Strategically, the oversight was even greater. Washington assumed economic influence would ensure political leverage. It believed that trade ties and defense deals would keep India within its orbit. But New Delhi, guided by quiet pragmatism, refused to play by that script. India diversified its partnerships, trading energy with Russia, defense systems with France, technology with Japan, and pharmaceuticals with Africa. Its economic diplomacy became multipolar before the term gained popularity. America misread this autonomy as indecision. It was, in fact, India's declaration of sovereignty through commerce. The Indian economy wasn't just growing, it was decolonizing itself economically, transforming trade from dependency to diplomacy. Then came manufacturing, the final twist in the irony. When America pushed for globalized production, it never imagined that one day India would challenge China as the world's factory. Make in India was mocked by analysts as a slogan, but within a decade it evolved into a serious industrial movement, attracting global giants from Apple to Tesla. India became the new destination for supply chains seeking stability, democracy, and scalability. The US wanted markets, but India became a competitor. It wanted influence, but India built independence. The balance of power and trade was no longer transactional, it was philosophical. At every turn, America's strategic oversight was rooted in underappreciation. It failed to grasp that India's ambition wasn't to follow, but to redefine. The country that once depended on Western aid was now lending to its neighbors. The nation that once imported technology was now exporting it. Even the International Monetary Fund began acknowledging India as the engine of global growth. The irony could not be richer. The student had surpassed the teacher, not through confrontation, but through consistency. America's misjudgment lay not in misunderstanding India's past, but in underestimating its patience. The real lesson, buried beneath decades of trade reports and diplomatic rhetoric, is that economic respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through foresight, something America lost the moment it mistook partnership for power. Diplomatic maturity is not built in the noise of applause, but in the silence of restraint. America, for much of its modern history, has thrived on the theater of politics. Grand declarations, bold ultimatums, and headline diplomacy. Its leaders spoke to the world as if it were an audience, not a collection of equals. India, on the other hand, cultivated a very different style, one that valued timing over talk, patience over pressure, and respect over reaction. The contrast between American showmanship and Indian subtlety became most evident as global power began to decentralize. While Washington often mistook visibility for influence, New Delhi proved that real strength in diplomacy lies in composure, not volume. In an era when foreign policy was increasingly performed rather than practiced, India refused to play the role of the eager ally or the anxious follower. It mastered the art of non-alignment in a world addicted to sides. This was not indecision, as America often assumed, but intentional flexibility, a refusal to be trapped in binary choices. Where the US saw hesitation, India saw strategy. Its measured approach allowed it to engage with Russia without alienating the West, to trade with China while fortifying its borders, and to lead the global South while maintaining ties with the developed world. Each move was calibrated, deliberate, and deeply rooted in long-term vision, a quality that American diplomacy, driven by electoral cycles and public opinion, often lacked. The difference between both nations' approaches was never clearer than in their crisis management. When America faced challenges, it responded with spectacle, sanctions, speeches, or military deployments that dominated news cycles. India, when provoked, often responded with silence that spoke louder than any statement. Whether it was border tensions, economic coercion, or global criticism, India rarely resorted to dramatic outrage. Instead, it chose to let outcomes speak. This quiet resilience often frustrated Western analysts who mistook it for passivity, but over time, that patience earned India something far more valuable than praise. It earned credibility. The world began to see New Delhi as a stabilizing force, a nation capable of keeping its composure even when others lost theirs. America's brand of political showmanship worked in an era when power was centralized. But as influence became diffuse, scattered across continents, cultures, and coalitions, that style began to look outdated. In the 21st century, diplomacy is less about dominance and more about dialogue. India grasped this evolution instinctively. Instead of issuing threats, it built trust. Instead of dictating alliances, it nurtured partnerships. Its emphasis on respect, sovereignty, and equality resonated deeply with nations tired of Western paternalism. The result was a quiet but undeniable shift. India became the voice of moderation in a world of extremes. It didn't need to shout to be heard. It needed only to speak at the right moment, with the right tone. Even in its dealings with the United States, India's maturity stood out. When pressured to take sides or follow policy prescriptions, it responded not with defiance, but with dignity. It didn't echo America's rhetoric, it reflected its own values. This independence was often mistaken for obstinacy, but in truth, it was evolution, the sign of a nation that no longer defined itself by external approval. America's showmanship, built on a foundation of visibility and validation, struggled to comprehend this quiet confidence. The US sought loyalty, India offered partnership. The US spoke in terms of leadership, India spoke in terms of balance. Over time, the contrast revealed not just two diplomatic styles, but two philosophies of power, one performative, the other profound. The ultimate irony is that America's most visible gestures often achieved less than India's calm silences. Each time Washington tried to dominate the narrative, New Delhi subtly redirected it. Each time it was underestimated for being too cautious. India proved that caution was its greatest strength. The world watched as India's steady hand guided it through turbulent times, economic crises, regional conflicts, and shifting alliances, while America's dramatic diplomacy often led to fatigue and inconsistency. The cost of political showmanship became clear: temporary applause but lasting instability. India, with its quiet maturity, emerged as the counterpoint, a reminder that diplomacy at its finest is not about being seen but about being understood. The cost of ignoring a partner is often greater than the cost of confronting a rival. For years, America viewed India through a narrow strategic lens, useful but not essential, friendly but not formidable. This perception shaped decades of foreign policy built more on convenience than respect. India was seen as a balancing piece in the global chessboard, not as a co-architect of the New World Order. The United States, comfortable in its status as the self-declared leader of democracy and capitalism, failed to realize that India was quietly building a parallel narrative, one rooted in sovereignty, balance, and inclusivity. What America mistook for passivity was actually patience, and by the time it noticed, that patience had matured into power. In ignoring India's potential as an equal, America underestimated the quiet revolution happening beneath the surface, an India that was no longer content with symbolic recognition, but ready for strategic respect. While the US sought to dictate global alliances, India sought to define its own. When Washington imposed sanctions or conditional support, New Delhi responded not with submission, but with self-reliance. America's foreign policy often revolved around nations it could control. India was never one of them. This inability to categorize or contain India frustrated policymakers in Washington who preferred compliance over complexity. Yet, it was precisely this independence that made India an indispensable partner in the long run. The cost of misjudgment became evident as global alliances began to shift. America's singular focus on traditional allies like the UK, Japan, and Israel blinded it to the growing clout of emerging democracies. When India began leading initiatives in renewable energy, digital governance, and the Global South's economic cooperation, Washington found itself reacting rather than leading. India was shaping conversations that America wasn't even part of, from South-South trade to digital sovereignty. In development aid, in vaccine diplomacy, in humanitarian response, India began to occupy moral and logistical space that the US had once dominated. The tables had turned, not through confrontation, but through credibility. Diplomatically, America's tendency to overlook India's sensitivities also carried a price. Each time Washington tried to lecture New Delhi on internal matters or align it too closely with Western agendas, it pushed India further towards strategic autonomy. Rather than tethering India, these moments of arrogance only reinforced its resolve to stand independently. When America sought to corner India on issues like defense imports or energy partnerships, India responded with quiet defiance, continuing trade with Russia, expanding ties with Iran, and engaging with BRICS, even as it strengthened relations with the West. America misread this balance as inconsistency, when in reality it was a masterclass in multi-vector diplomacy. India wasn't being rebellious, it was being rational. The cost of ignoring India wasn't just geopolitical, it was moral and cultural. In a world searching for credible leadership, India emerged as the bridge between global extremes. It spoke for developing nations, defended democratic ideals without hypocrisy, and modeled restraint in a world obsessed with reaction. While America's foreign policy grew increasingly performative, India's approach was grounded in quiet conviction. The difference lay not in resources, but in perspective. America believed influence came from might. India believed it came from trust. As a result, while the US struggled to maintain allies, India gathered admirers. Economically too, the price of oversight has been tangible. As India's market matured and its middle class expanded, American businesses found themselves competing for space in an ecosystem dominated by local innovation. The same India, once dismissed as a market for cheap goods, became a breeding ground for self-made billionaires, tech unicorns, and digital infrastructure the US could no longer ignore. Had Washington recognized India's economic trajectory earlier, it might have helped shape it. Instead, it is now adapting to it. A follower, not a guide. In the end, the greatest cost America paid for misjudging India was not financial or political, but philosophical. It failed to recognize that influence in the modern world is no longer about who commands the most power, but who commands the most respect. India didn't seek validation, it sought voice. America's mistake was trying to manage India when it should have collaborated with it, and in doing so, it missed a historic opportunity to stand alongside a rising partner rather than stand surprised before one.